You don't have to replace the potting soil in your containers, pots, and GreenStalk vertical growing system every single year. In fact, plan to reuse it. Join me today as I show you different ways that I reuse and revitalize my potting soil. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and every year I do more and more gardening in containers. Everything from 5-gallon buckets to pots to the GreenStalk vertical planter. And I plan on doing more and more container gardening in the future. If I had to replace the soil every single year, well, there'd really be few reasons to continue adding to my container gardening. But because I can reuse the potting soil and just take a few simple steps to revitalize the soil, I can not only keep doing what I'm doing, but keep doing more. The basic idea is no different than when we amend our vegetable garden beds in spring or fall. We want to replenish the nutrients within the soil and hopefully revitalize the life within the soil. And it can easily be depleted in containers. If I'm just growing in this pot with the original soil year after year, well, as I grow different annuals, which I usually use this pot for, every year the nutrients are going to be depleted until it reaches a point that there aren't enough nutrients to grow a plant in the third or fourth or fifth year. So by revitalizing our potting soil, what we fill our containers with, we can keep growing using the same containers year after year. Now, you don't have to revitalize your potting soil every year, depending on how you choose to amend it and what you do with the potting soil. I try to do it about every other year, and it does begin with the soil. This is my own recipe for potting soil that I blended up yesterday. And to this, I've already dumped a few of the containers that I had. And so with this pot, I'll just dump out the old soil, break it apart, and if I come across any big roots or plants that are still nestled in the pot, I'll pull them out. And then to the blend that I've already created, I'll mix in the old potting soil with this new potting soil. And just blend it all together, removing pieces of root and plant. I do prefer to use my own recipe when making potting soil. First off, it saves me money, and second, I know exactly what my plants are growing in. Now, you don't have to blend your own. You can buy potting soil and use it to revitalize all of your containers. My basic recipe is 2 parts of peat moss, 2 parts of compost, and 1 part of vermiculite. And to that, I'll add as many worm castings as I can harvest, up to about 25% of the mix. But I've never been able to actually harvest that much. I'll also add a fertilizer. Now, I use Osmocote, which is a slow-release 15-9-12 fertilizer. Because remember, we're trying to add nutrition to the soil. And you may be wondering why I don't use organic fertilizers like blood meal and bone meal, which I like to use in other applications in my garden. Well, the big reason is because, for the most part, this is a sterile mix, especially if you buy it in a bag. It's going to be sterile. There isn't going to be a lot of bacterial action within the potting soil. And it's those microbes that actually work to break down the fertilizers in a form that plants can use. In the case of organic fertilizers, we need more microbial action in the soil for those fertilizers to be available. For these type of fertilizers that you buy in a bag or a box, when they dissolve, in most cases, then they become available for the plants. So there isn't as great a need for the microbial action in the beginning. One of the reasons I like to add worm castings is because that will introduce some of the bacteria into the potting soil mix. So if you make your mix well ahead of time with the bacteria from the worm castings and from your own compost, then you can use the organic slow release fertilizers, and hopefully at that point, after some time, a few months, you'll have nutrient availability when the plants start growing. You can also use a cocoa core as the base for your mix, as opposed to peat moss. And you'll find a lot of bagged potting soils now that have core as the base. In all cases, whether you buy it bagged, make it yourself, use the cocoa core or the peat moss, you should have a moist soil when you do this. Both the peat and the core are hydrophobic, which means they tend to repel water. They take time to absorb the water. That's why I made this mix yesterday. I wet it very well and let it sit overnight. So now it's nice and moist. I don't recommend starting with a dry mix, because then when you put it into your container, well, right now this is nice and moist, and so I fill my container and I can start growing plants in it right away. But if your mix is dry, the first time you water, most of that water is just going to run through to the bottom, because the core or the peat is not going to absorb it very quickly. So start with a moist mix, and then you can start filling your containers. And so this pot is ready to go. It's as simple as that. I do things a little bit differently when I revitalize bigger containers or a system like the GreenStalk. I really like the GreenStalk. It was my first year last year, and I filled it with soil, and the level has already dropped about 3 inches from where I filled it. Part of that is due to the snow and the rain. Some of it is because the organic matter in last year's potting soil has begun to break down. But regardless of whether it's compaction or decomposing, I need to add more soil to this. I begin by just taking off each layer. And it can be a little heavy, so prepare for that. I'm wearing my back brace just so I don't hurt my back during the process. But I'll just pull off each layer until I get down to the bottom. And then I do the same thing that I did with the earlier pot, pulling out any plants or roots that still remain in the soil. But the difference is, because this is bigger, and I don't want to have to dump the whole thing out, I'm just mainly adding more soil in this case, in addition to adding the nutrient-rich soil, is I use a cultivator to loosen it. And then I'll add some more soil, and this is the new blend that has fresh fertilizer and organic matter in it. And then I mix it up again. This helps to decompact the soil. Mix it a little bit, but I'm not so worried about the very bottom layers of this soil being replenished, because most of what I grow in this container are shallow rooted plants. And so just by adding more soil, that should be enough. And then I'll go ahead and start reassembling it and move to the next level. And so now my GreenStalk is completely ready to go with revitalized soil. And I'll be putting some seeds and plants that I've been growing in it today. This is a great system. I love it. And you may have seen the video on this. I'll go ahead and put a card to it up here. You can link below if you're interested in purchasing it. Gardener Scott is a code you can use to get $10 off. It's a wonderful system. In fact, I think I need to actually get more. But let me show you what I do with bigger pots when it comes to revitalizing the soil. For a big decorative pot like this one, I definitely don't want to be lifting it, spilling out the soil to mix it with new. It's just too heavy. But I'll follow the same basic process by pulling out some of the plants and roots from last year and using my cultivator and the new Revitalize soil, I'll go ahead and raise the level and mix it up. And just like before, I went ahead and wet this soil ahead of time to make sure that this is moist, the new soil is moist, and as soon as I get it all mixed up, I'm ready to plant more annuals in this pot. So I'll mix this up. Again, I don't need to get all the way down to the bottom because the plants I'll be growing in here are going to have relatively shallow roots. I'll pour in the new mix and start mixing that in too. And it doesn't have to be perfect. If the new soil is mostly on top, that's okay, because the flowers are going to be growing mostly on top. But I've decompacted it, I've added fresh soil and nutrients, and now this pot is ready for planting. I treat a grouping of pots just like one big pot. Rather than carrying these over to the soil individually, I bring the soil to the pots. And then it's the same process, pulling out the old dead plants from last year, pouring the soil into the blend, mixing it all up, removing roots and plant material, and then filling up the container again. And this is ready to go. And I'll do the same with these couple others that I need to replenish. In this one, I've got chives, and they come back every year. So rather than replenishing the whole pot, I'll just go ahead and do a top dressing of some of the new fresh material. And that'll help keep the level up over the years and add some of the nutrients that this plant in particular needs. But for the most part, I'm revitalizing by reusing the soil that's here along with the new stuff. At some point, you may want to replace the potting soil in your containers. When that time comes, I suggest dumping the old potting soil into your vegetable garden, especially if you have a new bed that you need to fill. Well, that old potting soil still has nutrition in it and still has some good organic matter, and you can use that as partial fill. Or just add it along with the other organic matter when you amend your beds in spring or fall. You can reuse the old potting soil. Don't think that you have to throw it out because it has a lifespan. It continues to be suitable for plants as long as you continue to add the organic matter and the nutrients that the plants need. In very little time today, I've revitalized a number of my containers, and they're all good for this entire growing season. Next year, I really don't need to do the same thing again. I may go ahead and top off some of the containers that have settled a little bit, loosen the soil to relieve some of the compaction, but it's another 2 years before I need to make this effort again. There's a lot more that you can learn on the Gardener Scott channel. And so I suggest you go ahead and watch maybe this video on the GreenStalk system and maybe this series of videos to learn more. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.